Hi, guys. It's Mike Urban with the Fiscal Alliance Foundation. I'm sitting with none other than Paul Craney here, and we have a lot to talk about this week, don't we?
We sure do. There's a lot going on.
We will never, ever run out of things to talk about when it comes to Massachusetts, right?
It's a very target-rich environment.
What do you think we should begin with?
Let's talk about Prop 2.5.
Prop 2.5, okay.
You know, it's been in the news the last 12 months or so. I think the big thing was that Michelle Wu said last year, she said we should repeal this law. Mm-hmm. And then the Massachusetts Municipal Association, which is the association for selectmen, city councilors and mayors, they came out and did this big study that basically had one good point, which is local aid is way below the national average. But then they also said we should be basically changing Prop 2.5. And then all when this is happening, Maura Healey said, well, she was asked something about if something landed on your desk, what would you do on Prop 2.5? And she said she'll consider it, which is clearly the wrong answer.
Clearly.
But what is Prop 2.5? We're talking about this thing. It's a 1980 law passed by the voters that basically caps property taxes. And it is the gold standard in the country for pro-property tax laws. It's the only thing that kind of has kept property taxes in check. Mm-hmm. Well, all these other taxes are going up quite a bit over that time period. So if you're in Massachusetts and you own property, Prop 2.5 is that law that, forces towns and cities to go to the voters for big projects, for these overrides. And it is basically the last law in the state that's keeping, officials, people in government accountable to the taxpayers when they want to spend a lot of money.
The thing with Prop 2.5, and you just said it, it should be for when there's a big project, whether it be a new school, a new library, maybe they're going to totally revitalize downtown or the common area. But unfortunately, as you know, I speak about frequently, there's over 70 overrides as of the beginning of May.
Yeah.
These are more than likely not all for a new school, a new library, or a new town common.
Yeah.
This is just to keep a balance. And it's very problematic. And it's bad when Marblehead, the town that it was originated in, they just had an override and it passed $15 million.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where, and I've said this before, if you had maybe 3 to 5 repeat towns that every single year they had a problem with their budget, I think that you could kind of write them off as obviously having a problem with their budget, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe they're spending too much in one area or another. But when you have over 50 municipalities that are looking for overrides, I think that this is some kind of systemic problem, and it's only you're seeing a growth pattern. You could look at any chart, but you're seeing a growth pattern in it year over year over year. There's more towns that are looking for overrides. So you got to ask yourself, if I were governor, it's one of those things where I should be helping support these towns because they're helping support me.
Yeah, definitely.
And they won't even take a look at it. They really won't take a look at it. It's a shame because, as I've said, all you need to do is go to any local Facebook group and neighbor is pinned against neighbor, because you could argue for or against it. Depends on if you have kids, if you value these things, or maybe you're on a tight budget, right? Maybe you're retired and you don't want to spend any more money on taxes, or you can't, right?
Yeah.
You can't. And in a time where everything is so expensive in Massachusetts, it's just, it's not good.
Yeah, I think the comment you just made, the neighbor versus neighbor, is exactly what our state house leaders want, because it papers over their own failures with spending at the state level.
Exactly.
And they're pushing these mandates down to the towns. They're pushing it all down. Mm-hmm. And the local aid is now well below the national average for how you fund towns. So when you have the pressure of, the state saying you have to do X, Y, and Z to these towns and cities, and at the same time you have local aid below the national average, then you start to see neighbor on neighbor. And that's exactly what these politicians in the State House want. They want that distraction to kind of mask what they're not doing on the state level.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I always think about it from this perspective. It's like they'll do something, whether it be, try to pass the local options tax, or, for instance, under these circumstances, you have neighbor pinned against neighbor. None of this is done with, or I should say all of this is done with those intentions, right? Every move that gets made in the legislature creates this level of consequence that, people inside of these towns don't really think about. But it's only, think about it this way, it only benefits the legislature, no matter what they do. The local options tax is a perfect example. And what I said about this is they want these towns to have their own opportunity to impose even more taxes on the towns themselves so that the legislature could alleviate themselves from any transparency or accountability. I mean, that's it. I mean, you could, we'll get to it, but it's the same exact thing with the, what's it called? The rent control compromise. It's the same exact thing with the rent control compromise that they're trying to do.
Yeah, we can rip into the rent control. The last thing I'll say about the study, so the Fiscal Alliance Foundation did a study a few weeks ago to kind of counter some of the things I just mentioned with WU, with Healy, and the Mass Municipal Association. And what it basically showed was it's not Prop 2.5 is the problem. Prop 2.5 has been around since 1980, 46 years working well. It has kept property tax growth at a check. At the same time, it has been able to grow with the state, with towns' needs. And there's mechanisms there so that if a town needs a big spending project, it can do it, so long as it goes back to the voters. A lot of good data in there. It shows how much property taxes would have been the last 10 years, last 20 years, if we never had Prop 2.5. I encourage people that are watching this to check out Fiscal Alliance Foundation. You can download it, check out our social media pages. It talks about those numbers. But the other thing I thought was pretty interesting with Prop 2.5 was there's over a quarter of towns and cities in the state over 46 years who have never once done an override. And that kind of shows you, like, a lot of towns and cities know how to manage their finances pretty well. You mentioned the town, if you have a town that does like 3 years in a row, and that kind of speaks to the management of these towns. Prop 2.5 is not the problem. If anything, the problem is the state pushing the mandates down and not giving them the support they need. That's kind of what we're saying. And that, of course, is backdrop with the state's budget being the largest year over year with new programs. So it's a priority issue. So
it is. And I just want to comment on one thing. So the studies that you guys are doing, why isn't the state doing this? Why are you spending time, energy, and resources on studies? And I'm asking an honest-to-God question here. Why is the responsibility on, the Fiscal Alliance Foundation, me talking about it, other people talking about it? Why isn't the state looking into this and commissioning their own study with their own, even if it was a biased study, I would still take a look at it and point out what's good and what's bad. They don't want to do it.
I know.
Why is this?
Well, it's because first of all, they don't want you to look at local aid. That's the first thing. They want to pit voter against voter, neighbor against neighbor. That's what they want to do to us in Massachusetts. And so they don't want to study because they know what the results will be. But we think it's really important to do everything we can to preserve and protect Prop 2.5,
100%.
Educate the public on the taxpayers' interests. So I think the study has done a lot to kind of shift the conversation. Former mayor of Springfield, Massachusetts, came out, did an op-ed a few weeks ago talking about the study and why Prop 2.5 should be preserved. It kind of, it's resonating with people that kind of look at this more, closely instead of the partisan, let's just raise taxes because we want to.
Of course.
But let's talk about rent control. This is a big issue right now. I know you're kind of a quasi-expert dealing with this issue, but on one hand, you have a ballot question getting proposed. On the other hand, you have a compromise being thrown out there. You have a lot of knowledge working in real estate. What do you think about rent control?
Rent control, look, rents are high. Real estate is high. Everything is expensive in Massachusetts. There's no doubt that something needs to be done. But rent control, this is what I see happening, at least in this perspective. When you want to pass rent control and you want it to be a statewide blanket, I just feel as though that is the path of least resistance that they could take to try to offer relief instead of looking inward and saying, hey, why are rents so high? Rent control doesn't actually address the problem. It doesn't cure any symptoms. It's just another disease of the symptoms that the legislature has effectively created. And originally, now you may or may not know this or remember this, but not you, but I'm talking to the listeners. It was statewide. And then these advocates got together and said, you know what, let's meet with some developers, let's get their opinion on it, and let's see if we could come up with some kind of a compromise. And for any developer, I know I have a lot of developers that listen to me. For any developer that agreed to that compromise, I think you're kind of missing no offense, but I really think you're missing the forest for the trees here. Maybe you're in a tight position or whatever, and maybe you see this as a short-term win, but it's inevitably going to be a long-term loss.
Definitely.
And one point that I've been talking about with the compromise, and I haven't seen anybody look at it from this perspective, is that I think the compromise is more dangerous than the statewide mandate. And the reason I think the compromise is more dangerous is because it provides more ambiguity for the legislature, because you could have one town that, let's say, in the short term, rent control is working. And then you could have another town in the short term that it's not working. And what happens is, the legislature will capitalize and cherry pick data from the towns where it is working versus the towns that it isn't. So it kind of gives them an out. And then in order to, let's say, abolish it, it's going to be so much harder, because you're going to have this town it works, this town it doesn't, this town it works, this town it doesn't. The data will be all over the place. And again, it provides them with the opportunity to cherry pick that data. So in my opinion, the compromise is a trap. The compromise is something where it would be significantly harder to repeal rent control versus if it went statewide. We had all of the statewide data that it either is or isn't working in terms of percentages in all of these towns, versus being able to cherry pick these towns. That's my issue with the compromise. And I don't know if the developers thought of this. I don't know if they saw they saw greener pastures in the short term so they could, work on more developments and all this other stuff in areas that don't have it. I don't know what they were thinking, but inevitably, I think it provides less transparency for the legislature. That's what it's about. That's what this compromise is really about. Now, whether or not the legislature or the activists thought of it in that way, that's the reality. It'll just make it, if every town had it, I think it would be much easier to say it's not working, let's get rid of it. If a handful of towns have it, I think it'll be significantly harder to repeal, 110%. But it just, I know you guys need help. I know there's a lot of people that watch my channel that, are renting and stuff, and I know you guys need help, but this is realistically not the answer. And one of the reasons you could also say this isn't the answer is because there's no, in terms of the compromised version, I don't think even in the statewide version there was any levels of a impact study. So there's no impact study. So if there's no impact study, basically what that means is that they're kind of firing from the hip, hoping it works, and hope will not get you very far without some levels of data after something gets implemented, whether it be 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24-month study to see if it's actually working or hurting the towns. So I think that just goes to show you they want to implement something without having any kind of safeguards to whether or not to say it works or it doesn't work. On top of that, the compromise version, what it'll do, I think certain towns will be able to implement this differently. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think they may have to implement it in the form of the percentages. I think that may have to hold true. But like, let's say one neighborhood in one town has it, another neighborhood in the same exact town doesn't have it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
There's going to be no uniformity, is what I'm trying to say.
And also the towns that don't adopt it, but are adjacent to towns that do adopt it. Usually it benefits the town that doesn't have it.
Of course, it's going to be, because you're not going to have development. You're not going to have, people don't want to invest in Massachusetts. As it is.
As it is.
They don't want to invest in Massachusetts. And the reason that you see something like where developers will have a 10 or a 15-year gap where it won't apply on new construction and stuff like that, who cares, right? It's only a Band-Aid fix on a bigger problem. That's all that it is.
Nothing to say they can't go back and change the laws after if you've already started to develop your project. That's
Correct.
The other scary part.
Yeah, could you imagine being midway through a finance project and then you find out something happens? Because it doesn't, one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that it doesn't only affect the developer, it affects the investors that are lending the money on these projects, because that's why they don't want to lend on new projects here. That's why new construction permitting is down across the board in Massachusetts. It's atrocious. In Boston, I don't know if you know this, we have 49 new construction permits pulled in 2026. That's the lowest it's been since 2010.
Yeah, that's crazy, huh?
It is insane.
Yeah.
It is absolutely insane. So,
Boston also has a lot of problems.
Boston, yeah,
it's got, you can't even operate a lemonade stand without getting mugged.
Yeah, true. A lot of problems with one source, right? I think that they really, it's really surprising to me what's happening in Boston.
So this rent control proposal, we did a deep dive with a study.
Yep.
And we're talking about the ballot question that's getting proposed. And I kept on reading over and over again, just being like, I can't believe this data. But it would be the most aggressive rent control law in the nation if Massachusetts adopts this ballot question.
Yep.
We would be the first state on the East Coast, the fourth state in the country, and the most aggressive. So when we talk about rent control, a lot of times it's like New York City, Portland, Maine, St. Paul. These are cities and states. This would apply mandatory in every town and city overnight. It's not an opt-in. It's a mandatory January 1st. You have rent control, and the rates are built into last year's numbers. It's quite amazing how aggressive this proposal is. There's no adjustments for inflation. You know, if a tenant leaves, there's no resetting of rents. It is very cautionary for voters to look at this closely, because on one hand, you can be like sympathetic, right, to rents. You can be sympathetic to proposals around rent control if you have an opt-in, if you have adjustments for inflation. You know, these are other proposals around the country, but that's not what we're talking about. Massachusetts, we have the most aggressive proposal in the nation. So we just did a study. Data was very fascinating. We were looking at it from the angle of, okay, if you're not a landlord and you're not a renter, how does this apply to you? And, you know, if you happen to own a residential unit, you own a home, how does rent control apply to you on this question? Because there's always an indirect issue with economic issues with ballot questions. We found if this proposal is passed, about $312 per year is going to go up in your property tax bill. That's the average in Massachusetts. Some places in Boston, that's over $1,000 per year. In other jurisdictions as well. It all depends on how many rental units you have. But on average, $312 per year, your property tax bill will go up. Now, that may not sound like a whole lot if you're thinking about it, but think about like a 30-year mortgage. You know, if you're going to spend 30 years on a home, that's actually adds up quite a bit. And that's if you're not a landlord and you're not a renter, you're just a residential homeowner, your tax is going up. Because the simple theory is, and this has been proven in other areas, the valuations go down for these units. The taxes on those units is less. The towns don't reduce their spending. They have to get that money elsewhere. They go to commercial side, there's restrictions, and then they go to residential. That's just that's what happens everywhere. That 100%. That is a fact that happened in Portland, Maine. That's a fact that happened in St. Paul, Minnesota. These are facts. These aren't theories. This is just what happens in rent control.
This isn't a theory.
Yeah,
this is a fact.
So, we want to do the study. It's going to be interesting. The compromise, the compromise, if you want to call it that, was floated out there a few weeks ago. It's nowhere as aggressive. But frankly, if you want to reduce rents, if you want to support housing, rent control just isn't the answer. No matter how you look at it, it's just not the right 100%. Approach.
You know what happened in Portland? And I kind of brought this up. Not today, but in the past. So in Portland, what they did, and I'm trying to remember from what I was reading. So I think what ended up happening in Portland was once rent control was implemented, I don't think that Section 8 was affected. So what happened in Portland is that you had landlords that were not, let's say, they were very unlikely to set their unit up for Section 8. And let's also hypothetically say that the rent control on a 3-bedroom, 2-bath in Portland was $3,000, right? I don't know what the prices are there, but let's just assume it's $3,000 with rent control. Section 8 pays more per bedroom. So what ended up happening in Portland, to my knowledge, and there may be some agents from Portland that could correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm almost positive that most landlords converted their units into Section 8. The reason that they did that is because it was a way to skirt around the rent control laws and collect more money from Section 8.
And we've heard that what also happens is landlords will then convert into condos.
Or that's another,
which means if you're a renter, and this is a concern, there's less units for you to rent.
Correct. Not only are less units getting built, but because people, you're not going to get investment in these areas, but the units that you want to rent in a specific neighborhood or a specific area, the landlords are like, we're not going to collect less rent. We can't make things work. We'll just renovate it or just sell it as is. We'll condo it out and sell it as is. So there's no world where it really works. It's like, you got to think about the compromise should be figuring out why rent is so high.
Yeah.
This doesn't solve that problem at all.
No, it
it's
doesn't.
just a Band-Aid on a bigger issue.
Yeah, and there's a couple more things with this rent control study that I thought was very fascinating, which is rent control generally helps affluent renters. I didn't know this, but if you think of it, if you have an expensive rental unit, like $5,000, most of the time you can afford that. But for the lower income units, a lot of times those types of residents have to move around a little bit. And so those units then become basically not kept up. And that's also a factor in rent control. So it actually benefits more so skewed to the affluent renters than the ones that kind of the policies intended to help the most. So very cautionary tale. Massachusetts would be wise to look elsewhere for policies to affect housing and not pursue rent control.
One more thing I want to talk about rent control that I just thought about. You know what's crazy? And I could be wrong here. This may be a tinfoil hat situation, but they're increasing the emergency shelter from they dropped it down from 12 months to 6 months. Now they're boosting it to 9 months, right? A lot of people that were in the emergency shelters ended up going through the home-based program. Liz Miranda originally wanted to increase the funding to the home-based program from $30,000 to $45,000. That didn't pass. What's the next most logical step to save people that came here yesterday from paying high rents through a program that's funded by the state that's meant for U.S. citizens? It would be rent control. So you could essentially put more people for a longer period of time that otherwise couldn't afford a unit inside of these units. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like this is another way to skirt around that. Now, whether or not they thought of that on the back end, I'm not sure, but I'm willing to bet somebody did.
Yeah. And to that point, this was probably the last big point about this issue, but when Massachusetts had rent control, it concluded that people of color occupied only 12% of rent-controlled units, despite representing 24% of resident in rent-controlled cities. So think about that data point. You know, to the point earlier where it kind of primarily benefits more affluent units, it shows Massachusetts, when it had it, disproportionately didn't benefit people of color in the rent-controlled jurisdictions.
The people it's meant to help doesn't actually help the people that it was meant to help originally.
Yeah.
That's when you break down all of these programs and you start to look at them, you know, and put your critical thinking cap on. This is just stuff that they don't really anticipate that happens, but it happens. It never actually goes to or helps the people that it was meant to help. That's just the way it goes. All right, guys, that's it for the Fiscal Alliance Foundation podcast. I'm sitting with Paul Craney. It was fun, and we'll see you again next time.
The Fiscal Alliance Foundation is a nonpartisan, nonprofit 501c3 organization. Visit our website to read more about our alternative energy policy studies, sign up for important email updates, make a tax-deductible contribution, and follow us on social media.